Okay, all right, so this is questions from CASG, and we'll just go ahead and start. All right, so the first question is, considering all the evidence that Jesus existed, can you explain the lack of evidence of miracles performed by Jesus?
We certainly have Josephus' statement that he worked wondrous deeds, the word paradoxon, from which we get the English paradox from, may be a reference to Jesus' miracles. But I suspect the main reason is that the largest number of people who came to faith in the earliest decades of Christianity did so from some Jewish or pagan background. And when you automatically exclude their testimony on the basis that, well, they're Christian, so it might be biased, then you have actually skewed the evidence against anything that would support Jesus. If you really believed in Jesus' miracles, you probably became a Christian. If you allow for Christian testimony after the New Testament to count, the Apostolic Fathers, the second century Christian writers, talk about Jesus' miracles all over the place. So it's really a question that is skewed from the outset to say, why don't non-Christian writers talk more about his miracles? Non-Christian writers probably did talk about his miracles, but they became believers.
Gotcha. And a follow-up question to that, I read that at that time too there was a lot of miracle performers and that sort of thing too. Is that true, or?
I wouldn't say a lot. And some of the closest seeming parallels to some of the things Jesus is said to have done are 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, so they can't count. They weren't around in Jesus' day. There are stories of a couple of Jewish miracle workers, a man by the name of Hanina ben Dosa, and another one who was called Honi the circle drawer, because he drew a circle in the dirt and stood inside and prayed to God for rain and said, I'm not leaving the circle until you grant it to me. There are the occasional stories of Greek or Roman miracle workers, but if you are limiting the evidence to up through the 1st century, not a lot, and not terribly similar to what Jesus is said to have done.
Okay, gotcha. The dude that was standing in the circle, was he like having people bring him food and stuff?
I don't know that we're told how long he stood there.
Go give me a hamburger, bro. All right. So the next question is, what's an issue in your area that needs the most work from a theological apologetic perspective?
I'm not sure that there is a single issue that looms large that scholars haven't given lots of thought to. Most of the questions that skeptics raise today have been around throughout all of church history. The details may change a little bit from one generation to the next. I think what's needed in our day and age is just a lot of more familiarity with the approaches and answers and solutions that have already been given, and an awareness that in some instances there are multiple suggested ways of solving a problem, not all of which are maybe equally likely, and sometimes Christians, apologists included, rush to the first thing that they hear that might deal with the problem, but then find that they're not that convincing because they could have studied the matter longer and found even better solutions. So just an awareness in an age of information overload of everything that people have already investigated is probably the biggest need.
So yeah, that makes sense. I actually thought about this too because people tend to, your average Christian doesn't have any idea how the Bible was composed and that sort of thing. And so I'm always kind of like, do you tell people about this because then it will save them from future doubts and stuff too. But if they don't understand like the historical method or the method of history, then they can't understand why that's good evidence, and it still might sound like bad evidence to them. I guess I'm kind of curious, in your view, is there what do you think would be kind of like the basics that people should know for like your average kind of Christian in churches and stuff like that?
A book that was extraordinarily helpful to me when it first came out when I was a junior in high school was Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I had the privilege of reading through the manuscript of what is now going to be the third edition. Should be out within months. Josh's son Sean, who has a PhD in the theological disciplines and really has a much better formal education in these matters than his dad did, has been the mastermind behind the project. It's going to be a big book, but it is going to cover the waterfront of apologetics topics, and I think it is a must-read for anybody who cares about these issues.
Cool. That's good. All right. Next question is, what do you see as the biggest misunderstanding or misinformation that plagues the average skeptic?
Everything that Richard Dawkins has written. It's very interesting to compare the popular and so-called aggressive atheists and the issues they bring up, and then go to Society of Biblical Literature, which is open to any trained biblical scholar from any faith perspective or none whatsoever. And it is by no means an environment that is necessarily affirming of faith, but you realize the gaps. You realize that no serious scholar doubts that Jesus lived. The issue is, who was he? What kind of a teacher was he? What can we know about what he taught? There you have genuine scholarly debate. But skeptics who latch on to the claim that Jesus didn't exist are just barking up not even the wrong tree, but a different plant on a different continent, and they don't even know it.
All right, I gotcha. All right, so the next question is, I want to say Stolt. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay, Stolt, in his book History and Criticism of the Markian Hypothesis, argues that the Gospel of Mark is dependent upon the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Given that this is a minority position, what are your thoughts on his thesis?
There have been a handful of people throughout the history of biblical scholarship who have tried to put Mark last instead of first out of the three synoptic Gospels, and the only way for that to make sense is for Mark to be an epitomizer, to be someone who looked at Matthew, who looked at Luke, and said, I'm going to take a selection of these stories, not all of them by any means, and then I am going to create an abbreviated account of the life of Jesus. Now, we know that people did that in the ancient world. There are lengthy Roman histories in multiple volumes that people later came along and epitomized. But if you make the assumption that that's what Mark's doing, you come up with some rather strange observations. You find that he has left out most of the large blocks of Jesus' teaching, like the Sermon on the Mount, which we know already in the 2nd century was one of the most popular parts of the gospel tradition. He has left out more than 3/4 of Jesus' parables, including some of the most well-loved ones like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. But then, in a literary way, he has also done something very odd. The stories he has preserved far more often than not are longer in Mark than they are in either Matthew or Luke. So in what is supposed to be an abbreviated gospel, he's taking more time to narrate what he leaves behind. We are not aware of anybody in the ancient world who ever created summaries in that fashion. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's why the idea that Mark was written last rather than first has only commended itself to a very few writers.
Gotcha. Cool. And I'm kind of on the synoptic problem. Do you hold to the main view that Mark most likely was written first, the Markian priority? Okay.
I do.
And the Matthew priority is that do you feel like that argument for that is pretty tenable, or?
It's more tenable than putting Mark last, if only because there seems to be some solid support in the early church writers for saying that Matthew was written first. If you put the parallels in Matthew and Mark next to each other and simply ask which is more likely, that somebody writing this way would get turned into the other one or vice versa, usually Mark comes out looking like it's original. But then matters get even more complicated because the early church fathers also had a persistent tradition that Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus, a word that means the oracles or teachings of Jesus, in Hebrew or maybe Aramaic. Perhaps, if that is a true tradition, though no such document has ever been found, we can say that Matthew did write something first, but then later, after Mark in Greek was composed, decided to supplement his earlier writing and put it in Greek. That would be a way to honor the best of the ancient evidence and the best of modern scholarship, but it's a guess.
That makes sense. And that's Q that you're talking about, is that right or no?
It could be.
Oh, okay.
It wouldn't have to be.
Okay.
Q is by definition, the word Quelle in German means source, hence Q. By definition just means a hypothetical document that had information in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Now, when you ask, what is that? It's about 235 verses, almost all made up of sayings or teachings of Jesus, and now suddenly it sounds like what those ancient writers were talking about when they talked about Matthew writing something in Hebrew. So maybe those two go together, but that's not the only way to put pieces of the puzzle together.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, a couple more. So it says, some skeptics argue that the last part of verse 8 of Philippians 2 is fake or forgery. What are your thoughts on this?
The last part of verse 8 is different. That much is clear, because you have in verses 6 through 11 a very carefully crafted poem in the Greek that divides exactly in half. Some people have talked about a V shape because it starts with Jesus in eternity past with God, leaving that to come to earth in a very ignominious situation, like a life of a slave or servant, and finally coming even to die. And then God exalts him so that by the end of the poem, he's right back in eternity at the right hand of the Father. Within each of those two stanzas, if we can call them that, there are three parts each with 3 lines, each with 3 accented syllables, and they all break at a logical place. The one exception is even death on a cross, which is right in the middle, which has only 2 accented syllables in the Greek. But scholars, for the most part, don't talk about this as a forgery or an addition. They debate the question, was that Paul's stamp that he added to an already existing poem or creed or confession of faith or maybe an early Christian hymn? Because we know texts like that were sung in the ancient world. So it could well be that Paul, who elsewhere, 1 Corinthians 2:2, a passage that no one disputes, says, I determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified, is taking this beautiful poem about Jesus. Christ made it all the way down even to death, and then he adds his own one-liner, even death on a cross. That makes sense.
That's cool. All right. And actually, that was on my mind, and I can't quote it exactly. I don't remember, but I remember ERHMAN talks about in the blog that the beginning of Matthew was a later addition. That's right. Are you familiar with that claim at all? Or?
Not if it's something specifically from ERHMAN. Anytime you have a genealogy, genealogies tended to circulate independently of longer narratives. So certainly someone could come up with a hypothesis that somebody got a hold of this genealogy of Jesus and slapped it in where we find it now. But again, the question would be, why wouldn't that be something Matthew would do? If you read all of the rest of the gospel, Matthew is the gospel that most emphasizes Jesus as son of David. The first verse says, here's the account of the origins of Jesus the Messiah, the son of Abraham, the son of David. The genealogy is a selective genealogy. It leaves various generations out, because to say somebody begot someone could refer to a son or a grandson or a great-grandson. There are 14 people until you get to David. There are 3 groups of 14 generations. In the Jewish numerology that assigned a number to every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the number for David is 14. Matthew is the most Jewish gospel. Who else but Matthew would want to do something like this? Did he get the genealogy from some pre-existing source? Perhaps. But it certainly fits everything else he's trying to say in the gospel.
That makes sense. And if I remember ERHMAN right, and so I might be off, but he said the beginning, you know how the introduction goes where he says, he's dedicating it and it says these are the true events and that sort of thing. He says that I guess the language there shows to be different from like verse 8 and on or something along those lines.
Okay, now you're thinking about Luke.
Yes, Luke. I thought maybe I didn't say Luke, I'm sorry. I said yes, but I meant Luke.
Okay, you said Matthew.
Okay, so yeah.
Yes, that's very true. Luke's prologue is almost all of it is one giant sentence. It is written in as close to a more classical Greek style as you can find anywhere in the New Testament. It is very polished. It's what you would expect from the one Gentile author of the New Testament who probably was Greek, who, if the tradition is right, that he was a medical doctor, would have had to have been literate. The question then becomes, why does the Greek in verse 5, prologue is verses 1 to 4, change from there to the end of chapter 2 into a very Semitic style filled with all kinds of expressions that look like pretty literal translations of Hebrew or Aramaic. And then the style changes again at chapter 3 for pretty much the rest of the gospel into middle of the road, adequate but not spectacular first century Greek. The answer may have everything to do with sources. There's no way Luke could have known about the events surrounding Jesus' birth and childhood except from others he interviewed, or perhaps an ancient Hebrew source that preserved some of that. That could, either one of those explanations could account for why the Greek seems so Semitized. Starting in chapter 3, most of Luke follows either Mark or the so-called Q source, and both of those were written in acceptable but not spectacular first century Greek. Luke's going to conform to that style even when he makes changes or additions or deletions. So a little bit of source criticism can make sense of that, but it doesn't call into question anything related to Luke's reliability.
Cool. Good. All right. A couple more questions. So Luke at least, this guy says that he read your book on the history of the New Testament, or the historicity of the New Testament, and he said that you have a brief mention about Acts being dated late in there,
right,
but didn't expound on it. So could you expound on that a little?
Even though it was a big book, I was trying to cover a lot of topics and could fairly be criticized for having brief accounts of just about everything. There are a handful of scholars, particularly those who were involved in the follow-up to the Jesus Seminar of the 1990s, who called themselves the Acts Seminar and published their findings just a few years ago, who date both Luke and Acts very late, later than the vast majority of the scholarly guild, and we're not just talking about conservative scholars, into the 2nd century. There are a lot of things that could be said about that, but one key one is there are parallels between Luke and Josephus, the Jewish historian that no one doubts wrote between the 70s and the 90s. The vast majority of scholars say where there are conceptual parallels, Josephus most likely knew of, if not Luke's gospel, at least the Christian traditions that were circulating that by this time were well known throughout the empire and certainly in Israel. In order for the very late date to work, for Luke and Acts, you have to reverse those lines, and you have to assume that the writer of Luke Acts, who now cannot be Luke, the beloved physician of Paul, was actually following Josephus. And as far as I can tell, the people who make that claim don't really defend it. They just make it as an assumption. And I think that's perhaps the weakest part of that hypothesis.
That makes sense. Okay, cool. All right, 2 more. This one's from one of my atheist friends. He says, considering the reliability of oral culture to hold messages over decades, all of the examples that we know of suggest that oral culture can change as much as 40% from one telling to the other. He said this is even in practice cultures, and that only the key details are usually preserved, assuming the community all agrees upon which of those details are. Given this, what are your views on the credibility of the cultures and why?
Well, I'm glad he has done his homework well, because I think he got that figure of 40% either from my writings or from somebody who read my writings, because I'm only familiar with one fairly obscure technical study from the 1970s that provides that information. He's absolutely right in everything he says, but he has to say more. There were communities that were much more careful in preserving orally stories that were significant to them. There were cultures that virtually memorized information that was very important to them. In fairness to his position, at the other end of the spectrum, there were settings where people changed more than 40%. So the argument is not that there couldn't have been significant change in the oral tradition. The question is, which analogy is closest to the earliest Christians with their conviction, whether you believe it or not, that Jesus was God's heaven-sent Messiah, that he had a message of good news that could revolutionize the world and individual communities and people's lives for the better. Given this conviction, and also given that it was birthed directly out of Judaism, which tended to be on the very conservative end of the spectrum in terms of preserving tradition, which analogy is closest to the life of the earliest Christians? It seems like they would have had some very good reasons for keeping things very close to the vest, as we might say today.
That makes sense. Cool. And would you say like kind of them sticking close to the sources or some of these reasons, or about, I mean, can you give a couple or maybe one or two of the reasons? Or
you look at the typical education for Jewish schoolboys. Unfortunately, from our perspective, it's unfortunate it was just boys, but elementary school from approximately the ages of 5 to 12 or 13, if people were within reasonable walking distance of a synagogue. Certainly that would have been true of Jesus and his disciples, with synagogues that we know of in Nazareth and Capernaum and Galilee. Only one subject was taught, the Hebrew Scriptures, because of the belief that somewhere in the Bible was teaching relevant to every walk of life, every issue of any significance that people would face. And there was the rabbinic tradition that it was important to memorize word for word the Holy Scriptures. In some instances, teachers insisted that every child be able to recite a particular passage flawlessly without a single error before you even began to discuss it, because otherwise you might be misrepresenting the text. I would love for Christians to reinstate that, but I know they never will. And so, in fairness to counter-arguments, that was with Scriptures already in writing. We can't say the same thing to the same extent about oral tradition, but we do know that the oral traditions of the Pharisees were repeated and were recited and were expanded over time, but supplemented more than distorted. We can compare in the later Jewish documents of the Mishnah and Talmud places where multiple documents write down the same oral traditions, and there are differences. But what is striking is that often there will be long stretches that are word for word the same.
Cool. Makes sense. And the last question is, when is Jesus coming back?
No, this watch is too cheap. It's not giving me an answer.
Right,
somebody, it's funny because I was telling students if this video for any strange reason, gets saved beyond the year 2017, it's important to say that it's July 2017 at the moment. But the last apparently serious date setter was Harold Camping in, I think, 2011.
I remember that.
And, of course, here we are. To date, everybody who's set dates has been wrong. That's pretty impressive 100% track record of being wrong. Jesus actually predicted that we couldn't know, so we shouldn't be surprised. But I was telling students this year, spring of 2017, that it's about time, because of our almost antipathy as Americans for studying history or studying it seriously. We don't learn from our mistakes. And we have this collective amnesia. It's about time for another prediction, and it's probably good. I can't remember where it came from, but I did see an article just this summer where somebody has a date in 2022. So, we got to hang in there 5 years before we can prove them wrong. But don't go down that road.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, that covers it, man. So
good.
So thanks.
Thanks.
And,
fun stuff.
Now you look in the camera and go, "What do you mean?" Something like that.
What do you mean?
Yeah.